They are hoping that what that will cause is a backlash internationally that helps isolate Israel. And the more isolated Israel is, the better their chances are in a long-term conflict to undermine Israel's military capabilities, undermine its economy, and eventually destroy the state of Israel. That's Hamas's goal, is to break Israel's connections with its allies like the United States in order to make it a weaker state and to eventually overthrow it and replace it.
Today we have the privilege of being joined by Ryan Bohl, a Senior Middle East and North Africa Analyst with the RAIN Network. During this conversation, Ryan and I discussed the recent terrorist attacks from Hamas in southern Israel, as well as Israel's response bombing of the Gaza Strip. I hope you find this conversation not only engaging, but also informational. Enjoy. Hey, Ryan, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Good, it's good to meet you.
Yeah, nice to meet you as well. So this is a new podcast then?
This is a brand new podcast, and you're one of the first scholars we're interviewing.
Okay, well, great. I'm excited to be part of it. I was curious, is there a little background you could tell me about where the podcast is coming from and all of that?
More than happy to. Yeah, absolutely. So it's a personal venture. I've been in technology for the past 8 years. Before that, I interned for a counterterrorism think tank, and I have a great passion for this sort of area. I have a good amount of, I would say, reasonably well-educated friends who don't know much about this. And with the recent events happening, I'm right now launching the podcast in the hopes of bridging that gap a little bit and hopefully interviewing scholars like yourself to make it a little bit more approachable for broader audiences.
Okay, well, sounds good.
The first question is, taking a little bit of a step back, one of the few things I'm finding that U.S. Conservatives and liberals are agreeing on these days is an interest in isolationism. I think it might be due to fatigue of the war on terror or the Ukraine-Russia war. I'm really curious, before we jump into this, what are your thoughts on why does this matter? Why is this an important topic? Why should a coffee barista in Austin or a farmer in Iowa pay attention, and why could this matter to them?
Well, and I think that's a good question because it can seem like a lot of folks are getting dumped with bad news from abroad. Ukraine and Syria, Libya. Morocco had a massive earthquake, so it can feel like there's too much noise. What is at stake here for ordinary Americans? Of course, there's lots of people who have religious feeling about the area, and that automatically gets them vested in the issue. For everybody else who may not have those sort of social or religious connections to Israel and Palestine, it has a lot to do with the regional escalation scenarios and the notion that this war starting in Gaza may not just stay in Gaza, and we are watching very closely the northern frontier between Israel and Lebanon. If that begins to escalate in a military situation, it pulls in Hezbollah, a militant group based out of Lebanon. If it pulls in Lebanon, it may then pull in Iran. And if it pulls in Iran, then the United States may feel the need to step in. And if the U.S. steps in, we're then looking at an energy shock, similar to what we experienced with the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022. I'm sure everybody noticed that their gas prices skyrocketed, but so too did their food prices. So too did a lot of commodities that they rely on for things like cars. The big driver of inflation for Americans was not just COVID and government spending, but also the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And so we are monitoring it for those economic effects, as well as these strategic effects, because the United States is involved in trying to deter the Russians from taking over Ukraine. They're providing a substantial amount of military hardware there. Some of that military hardware actually overlaps with what the Israelis use. And there is concerns that with an escalation between Israel and Iran or Israel and Hezbollah, you're going to end up in a situation where the U.S. is forced to make choices between supplying the Ukrainians or supplying the Israelis. So there's a military dimension. And the last but not least is the notion that this could cause a resurgence of jihadist behavior globally. The United States defeated the Islamic State in about 2017, suppressed it to an underground movement. Al-Qaeda and bin Laden, sure, nobody thinks about that, in their everyday life anymore. But there was a massive alert put out today across most major U.S. cities about the prospect of unrest and individual attacks related to this. And so regardless of the final outcomes of this Gaza war, there will be a resurgence in radicalism, and that creates a national security threat to Americans, both here and abroad.
I love that. I think that's a phenomenal answer. So I don't have any follow-ups to that. I appreciate you taking a moment just to go over that, because I think it is important to sort of contextualize why we're talking about this in the first place.
Yeah.
Talking first about geopolitical landscapes, I'm curious, given your significant expertise in unraveling complex global dynamics, How do you interpret the recent surge in the conflict between Hamas and Israel, especially considering the broader geopolitical landscape in the Middle East and North Africa?
So this is, of course, this is like an hour-long answer.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I'll try
That's
to
very
summarize,
fair.
yeah, as best I can. We can focus on the short-term drivers of this particular war. And the short-term drivers is that the Israelis attempted a strategy with Hamas that has now failed. And the strategy with Hamas prior to this was an aid for calm strategy, where the Israelis, who control the Gaza Strip's borders, would provide humanitarian aid to Gaza, and in exchange, Hamas would limit their escalations against Israel to largely rocket fire that Iron Dome could shoot down. So there was sort of this weird détente that the two of them had developed since the last major war in 2014. And the Israelis believed that they were moderating Hamas over time, and so too did the Americans, so too did many outside observers, believing that Hamas was steadily getting to that place where they were being moderated by this incentives. And we now know that Hamas was not planning on moderating, that in fact, especially their militant wing, the Al-Qassam Brigade, was preparing for this major operation.
And if you could just provide some clarity, because this might be more obvious to more people than me, but I don't know how well are the West Bank and Gaza governed by Hamas? Because from my understanding, it's yeah, please.
No, it's a good basic setting that we should have. Of course, there are two geographic zones of what we would consider Palestine from the UN standpoint. Now, there's lots of arguments about what Palestine means. Some argue that it's the former British mandate that Israel is Palestine, etc. But beyond those semantics, from an international perspective, from an international law perspective, Palestine is broken into the West Bank and to Gaza. Gaza is that tiny strip that's currently under military assault by the Israelis. The West Bank is this big chunk of territory next to Jordan, and it's called the West Bank because it is the west bank of the Jordan River. And it is filled with Israeli settlements, it is filled with Israeli military bases, and then it is partially controlled by a Palestinian authority, an internationally recognized government of the Palestinians. And they have a relationship with Israel that is largely functional, if strained. Their security forces go on raids with the IDF, with the Israeli Defense Forces. They take taxes from the Israelis that they collect on behalf of the PA. They take international aid. They take American aid from time to time. So the PA is a functional part of the Palestinian political scene. Hamas is the militant part, which has no international recognition with the exception of places like Iran and Syria. It does not get any sort of a seat at the table at the UN. The PA gets to go to the UN, make speeches, and then the Hamas does not. So Hamas is considered a terror organization by the European Union, Israel, the United States. Most countries consider them a formal terror organization. And so they are two very different entities, and they kind of give you a touch of how complicated Palestinian politics is, because the further you drill down, the more factions you discover. But broadly, that's what we're looking at. And the PA is not facing a military assault by the Israelis. They didn't carry out these attacks into southern Israel last week. In fact, they're working right now to try to control Hamas within the West Bank in conjunction with the Israeli Defense Forces. Mind you, they're deeply unpopular for doing so, and then many people would like to get rid of the Palestinian Authority because of its cooperation with Israel, but they do still exist, and they do still have an impact on the ground.
Okay, that's super helpful. In my own research of trying to distinct the term militant from the term terrorist, so all terrorist groups fall under militant groups. Militant groups are groups of individuals that are willing to engage in armed conflict or battle in order to progress some sort of ideology, political, religious movement. And then terrorist groups are a subset of those that are also willing to, what would you say, actively target civilian populations. So that's a subset of militant groups. What are your thoughts on Hamas being, it seems clearly, unless Hamas as a broader, unless Hamas's leadership is denouncing the attacks that happened on Saturday, then it seems hard for me to understand how you could not consider that to be a terrorist organization. However, I can see an argument for why if IDF is targeting buildings where they're residential buildings and we know that there are tunnels underneath, it's questioning whether or not they're actually targeting civilians. I understand the root cause for why, but any thoughts you have on this? I think this is something that people are battling with right now.
Right. And this is a place where I've been saying this to some of my friends, that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a place where your moral compass kind of goes to die because of how complicated it is and how many counter narratives exist. Now, in the question of militant versus terrorist, we as an organization use the term militant to describe basically everybody. Taliban, Al-Qaeda, ISIS. groups that the US and most people would say those are terrorists. We call them militants because militants to us is more descriptive and more precise. Because what a militant group is doing is trying to take on a superior power using underground and guerrilla tactics. They're using asymmetric warfare. And terrorism is really a description of a tactic, which is to inflict fear. Now, whether or not that fear is directed towards military or civilian targets doesn't necessarily matter as much as what a terrorist's tactical goal is, which is to use enough fear to inspire a policy change from a government. It's an underground movement that is hoping to throw a bomb at a location in order to get that government to change a rule, withdraw its troops, etc., out of fear of further attacks. So militants are doing the same thing. Militants are underground movements that just don't have a government behind them. They don't have a state. They aren't backed by some informal army. You wouldn't consider the Vietnamese army, the Viet Cong in the 1960s in the Vietnam War. You wouldn't call them militants. They were guerrillas because they were still backed by a proper government in the northern part of that country. Hamas doesn't have a government backing it. They're militants. They're on their own. They're organized out of grassroots anger over Israeli policies. And they choose to engage in tactics, which are certainly by the standards of what remains of international law, considered acts of terrorism, which is why the U.S. and the EU all consider Hamas a terror organization, both its political and its militant wing, which does matter because there's some organizations out there, they can have their political wings wandering around raising funds, and their militant wings can be out carrying out acts of terror. And in some cases, governments will separate the two. In Hamas's case, the whole organization all the way through is considered a terror organization. And maybe it's perhaps useful to think, why would Hamas do these things? Why would Hamas strike Israel in this way and kill so many civilians? Every asymmetric militant group has a power imbalance problem. Their problem is they are taking on a force that is stronger and better armed and with full logistics supply chain that they don't have. So what do they do in that case? It's similar to the David-Goliath kind of analogy, except what they're trying to do is provoke their enemy into making a mistake, causing them to cause an overreaction, which results in that country weakening itself through that overreaction, which results in the policy changes that the militants were looking for to begin with. So, good example of this is, why did Al-Qaeda attack New York City and the Pentagon? Why didn't they just go after U.S. military targets? Why did they go after civilians? Because they knew that killing civilians is more likely to cause an overreaction, which is exactly what the U.S. did. It invaded Afghanistan and Iraq very quickly, without a whole lot of thoughtful planning. And the hope from Al-Qaeda was that by the U.S. doing that, it would be bogged down in guerrilla wars that would weaken the U.S. military, force it to withdraw from the region. That would weaken enemy allies like Saudi Arabia and Israel, and allow Al-Qaeda to attack them and overthrow them. It didn't totally play out that way. Obviously, the U.S. did not succeed in Afghanistan. That was a pretty full-scale defeat there. In Iraq, it was a mixed picture. But nevertheless, the U.S. didn't abandon the region because of it. And Hamas is making the similar calculation. By provoking Israel into a full-scale invasion of the Gaza Strip, which is already going to be the most militarily expensive campaign the Israeli military will have ever fought. It's going to have high casualties and a lot of international condemnation. They are hoping that what that will cause is a backlash internationally that helps isolate Israel. And the more isolated Israel is, the better their chances are in a long-term conflict to undermine Israel's military capabilities, undermine its economy, and eventually destroy the state of Israel. That's Hamas's goal, is to break Israel's connections with its allies like the United States in order to make it a weaker state and to eventually overthrow it and replace it. So, and it takes a lot of faith to believe that that strategy will work. That's why religious ideologues tend to be the ones that do these the most often, because they kind of have to have faith-based thinking to believe a strategy like that can be successful.
Yeah, but that is far and away the most sophisticated take I've heard on what their logic or rationale might be. It's more frightening, candidly, than just their radical extremists that are just doing this and not thinking at all. Like that's thoughtful.
We ascribe, in geopolitics, we ascribe a rational actor model to everybody. Everybody has a logic behind them. Which logic they're pressing on depends on the group, but we have logic. We have political logic, which isn't always the same as economic logic, which isn't always the same as social or historical or even security logic. And you can't have all of those strands of logic going in your mind all at the same time. But a good example is a lot of folks missed the invasion of Ukraine by the Russians because the assumption was that if Russia does this, it'll destroy their economy. And doesn't everybody love their economy? Don't we all like money? Well, that's a Western liberal mindset. The Russians are willing to
Right.
put up with economic pain for strategic gain. They're willing to fight a long war with high casualties. That is just something that their society is willing to put up with. And that's part of the reason it caught so many Americans off guard, because our assumptions, our social assumptions, are not the same from place to place. And Hamas, of course, is in the Gaza Strip, which has been described pretty accurately as an open air prison where people cannot come and go for years at a time. Half the population has been born since Hamas was took power in 2007. So you have a very young population that doesn't know anything other than the Gaza Strip.
Wow.
And so their social logic, their economic logic is very different because they don't believe they have an economy worth preserving, and they don't necessarily believe that they have a lifestyle that shouldn't be disrupted by taking a chance like this. And so that's part of it. And of course, there's also the politics of rage. There's the politics of hate. Hamas is, in many ways, it is a radical group that's not too far off from ISIS in terms of ideology. Their ideal would be to destroy the state of Israel, and that probably would involve the significant slaughter of a fair number of its civilians in that process. That is what they believe. That's part of their ideology, and there was a belief they were moving away from that, and clearly they have not.
Yeah, not so much. Well, this is something that I also don't know. So there's tremendous sympathy, I think, around the world right now for Israeli citizens because of this horrible atrocity that was just committed. I think that that's very true. There's also tremendous amount of sympathy for the non-militant civilians in Palestine and what is happening right now. It's not. I have no idea if it's 1%, 5%, or 95% of Palestinians that hold the belief that they would like to see all Jews exterminated and they would like to see Israel dismantled as a state. Do you have any sense as to how popular is that of an idea?
It varies from place to place there, and it varies from time to time. We've seen a lot of like undercurrents, particularly in the West Bank, where some are younger Palestinians have been hoping for something like a one-state solution, so to speak, in which they are part of Israel and they become citizens of Israel and they're able to vote and take part in its democracy. There's some that believe that.
It's very democratic.
So there's others who still want the two-state solution, which I think is still overwhelmingly the most popular position for most Palestinians, is to have two independent states. The sticking point with that is that many Palestinians want at least half of Jerusalem, and Israelis, particularly far-right Israelis, are absolutely unwilling to budge on that. That's one of the sticking points. And then there's plenty of other Palestinians who are just apolitical. They don't really have a thought on this beyond just getting through the day-to-day, which is normal of most large groups of people, and they'll just go with whichever way seems easiest. And then you do have radicals, a substantial number of radicals, to the point where they're able to carry out these campaigns and organize these militant groups. You don't really get popular surveys out of Palestine, out of particularly the Gaza Strip, because it's so hard to operate. We know that Hamas was somewhat unpopular there before this war began, and that may have been a driver for why Hamas has decided to attack Israel. Forcing Israel to take over the Gaza Strip means Hamas gets to go back to its comfort position as an underground movement. They don't have to make decisions about taxes or running banks, which they were not terribly good at and didn't seem to like doing. And if that can become Israel's problem or another governing authority's problem, that can benefit Hamas. So it's hard to give it an exact number. You just have those substantial communities in them. They're all mixed in. And of course, like anywhere else, you probably ask two Palestinians, one question and you'll get five answers. And opinions are nuanced and divided. The only political barometer that you can kind of use to get a gauge of sentiment 15 years ago, Hamas did win the elections, the only elections that were held in.
I was going to ask you this.
Yeah, that was the only one that's been held. We don't know if they would win again. There were expectations that a couple of years ago they might have held new elections, and there were expectations that they would do well if those elections had been held a couple of years ago, and so the elections were canceled in part of that. So they have some popularity. But whether or not this military strategy was popular is certainly with what's happening now. I don't know if we'll know until well after the war is over, if we'll know ever.
I'm curious to your thoughts as well. I've read that we don't always know with complete certainty the legitimacy of elections in Arab countries, particularly. Curious your thoughts, like when Hamas won an election, what did that process look like? Do we have any idea if that was real?
That was as legitimate as you're going to manage in the Arab world. And there's been some democracies like Tunisia that have now come and gone. And then Lebanon also has elections, but they're deeply dysfunctional to the point where they're clean, but they almost don't have an effect on the state's behavior.
Right.
The one in 2007 had international observers and it had the Israelis overlooking things, and so it was considered a legitimate election in terms of its process. But a lot has changed in the past 15, 17, 18 years. I mean, the U.S.
Yeah, no kidding.
2007 is quite different than it is today. So I don't think it's an accurate barometer anymore. That being said, the idea of whether or not what Hamas did was popular may not matter nearly as much as whether or not Hamas is more popular after this war, which is a distinct possibility given the Israeli military campaign.
Yeah, I need to look this up, but the Greek god or mythology where you cut off one head and two come back.
Yeah, the Hydra. Yes. Yeah, exactly. And that's the militant model, which that's well, a lot of people will say, well, why don't you just kill all of Hamas's leadership? Well, there's one problem with that, which is Hamas has leadership in Qatar, which is a U.S. ally. It's a major non-NATO ally. So there's no Israeli campaign going to happen there. Others are in places like Lebanon, Syria, or Iran, and attacking them there could trigger a region-wide conflict. So you can't necessarily get them. But the Hydra thing also matters because the U.S. has killed God knows how many leaders of ISIS at this point.
Right.
I've lost track, honestly, of how often they assassinate the leader of ISIS. It doesn't end up mattering because they always have a replacement. Militant models have that built in which the bench is very deep. The way to defeat a militant group, there are two ways, broad ways to do it. There's the brutal way to do it, which is what the British did to the Boyars in the Boer War, which is to depopulate the place, put people into concentration camps or move them out of a location, and then you end the militant movement because they're no longer physically there. And the British did that successfully to defeat the Boyars around the early 20th century. The other is to change the social and economic conditions of that given place so that people's lifestyles are good enough and their needs are being met on what their culture expects, that they don't find militant movements attractive. And that's tricky for the Palestinians. That's very tricky to do because some Palestinians believe they should have the right to return to their old homes in Israel or their ancestral homes in Israel. And doing so will change the demographic balance of Israel, possibly change its status as a Jewish state. And many people in Israel don't want that either.
Yeah, so complicated.
Like I said, where your narratives go to die. It's You find individual heroes. Finding a group of heroes, I don't think is possible in geopolitics, and particularly with this conflict.
So the case you mentioned is that I listened to a talk you gave earlier talking about depopulation. I think it was the term you used, and it was in the 1930s. It might have been the same example you just said about how British pushed out people, and that solved their problem pretty brutally. With Israel right now aligning their army or military on the northern wall of Gaza, potentially with the idea of moving south and telling 1 million Palestinians to move south and then potentially move into Egypt if Egypt is okay with that. Like, does it seem plausible that Israel is looking at that as a realistic solution for this?
Some Israelis are, and we know that. The far right in Israel, and it's important for people to know, there is part of the Israeli government right now is a party called Religious Zionism. And Religious Zionism is a far right Jewish ultranationalist party that believes in the expulsion of Arabs from all territories that Israel controls, believes in the full annexation of all of these territories, and some of them even would go so far as to say that Israel should expand in the direction of Jordan, in the direction of Syria, in the direction of Egypt.
Whoa.
They're far-right ideologues, and they were actually made illegal by the Israeli government back in the early 90s, and the U.S. The movement is called the Kahane movement, and it was outlawed, and they went underground for a long time, reorganized, got a new name, and then they dropped some of that talk about expanding and conquering a lot part of the Middle East, but they haven't given up on the idea of expelling Palestinians, expelling Arabs. And I think that's actually an important point to note is that Israel's population, 10% of or so of them are Arabs. They're Israeli Arabs. They're still Palestinian Muslims. Some are Christian.
Yeah.
And they serve in the military. They serve in the police. They have political parties in the government. And the far right wants to get rid of them too. They want a purely Jewish state. And they don't necessarily want secular Jews. They want ultra-Orthodox or far-right Jews. And so even some of the liberal Jews are their enemies. And they have a political party in the government. It is currently the third largest party in the government. And so they have influence over Israel's policies. Now, they don't have enough influence to force Israel into a depopulation strategy, but that is what they are aiming for through this cycle of escalation. The attack from Hamas was something of a godsend for them because it justifies their narratives that Palestinians cannot be lived with or lived amongst. They have to be expelled and sent someplace else. So the answer is, could it end up being depopulated and the what we would call another Nakba, the catastrophe of 1948, where Palestinians left their homes and never returned? It is possible. It is, especially if Egypt opens up its borders and or Palestinians start to crawl, get over that border. They crawl over the fence. They blow it up with bombs, and they get through. And there's a large surge of Palestinians going in that direction. We can't rule that out. And Egypt may feel the need to allow these folks in because they certainly don't want to have their tanks shooting into crowds of refugees. If that's the case, it is possible that with this current Israeli government, none of these refugees are allowed to return to the Gaza Strip. And the Gaza Strip, of course, is internationally recognized territory as Palestinian. Even the Israeli government calls it Palestinian territory. But under this government, it could be something that they would aim to do.
I would imagine that would create a tremendous amount of stress on the Egyptian government to be able to support all those refugees. Who helps them?
Right, and this is how this whole world is connected. Egypt is struggling with high inflation, high unemployment. A lot of it's been caused by the Russian invasion of Ukraine because Egypt was a huge importer of Russian fuel and Russian wheat and the Ukrainian wheat. And so those price shocks have reverberated through the Egyptian economy. And so Egypt can't really afford any more people than it's already got. It's already got a huge population that it's trying to bring down and try to moderate from growth because it's concerned with climate change, that it won't necessarily be able to support all of these people. 2 extra million people, many of whom might involve some militants who might go after the Egyptian government as well, are not terribly welcome from Egypt's perspective, and they want to keep them in the Gaza Strip if they can, but they may not have a choice as the ground invasion unfolds.
The role of media and information. So your contributions to various media outlets have provided insights into different geopolitical events. How do you assess the role of international media in shaping perceptions and narratives surrounding the Israel-Hamas conflict? And what should audiences be cautious of when consuming related news?
So it's obviously media has a role in giving people the tone of what the conflict looks like, of what the war looks like. Like you were talking about, the difference between media that uses the word militant versus terrorist. They are aware of the impact that using those kinds of words has, and so they all are part of implicit or explicit attempts to shape a narrative. Sometimes it's implicit because they're going after a certain audience. They're like, well, Fox News knows their audience is all pro-Israel, and so they will use the word terrorist.
Fair.
Al Jazeera knows that it's pro-Palestine. They'll go for militants.
Freedom fighter or something a little different.
Exactly. And of course, Al Jazeera is controlled by the Qatari government, and the Qatari government is explicitly pro-Palestinian. So Al Jazeera is not just chasing an audience, it's also doing a political campaign on behalf of the Qatari government. And that's relatively normal. Even in free media places, places like New York Times and Washington Post and London Times, they're all sort of trying to follow roughly both a combination of what the government wants as well as what their readers want, and trying to kind of stick that landing. And I think the only thing that can be the best way to know about this conflict is to consume media of as much both sides as you can. And for English speakers, my recommendation would be reading the Times of Israel, which is a fantastic source. It's Israeli, it's pro-Israel, but it's not overtly pro-Israel. It's very factual, but nevertheless, they're going to be called terrorists. It's going to emphasize Israeli casualties. And then the opposite is Al Jazeera English. And Al Jazeera English will give you the Palestinian perspective, the Palestinian understanding of what is going on. And just keep in mind that neither of them are going to give you the complete picture. And I don't think there's a possible way in which you can create a complete picture in any given article. This nuanced and complicated and emotional conflict is automatically impossible to describe in a soundbite, and it's impossible to describe in a short article. And when people go back to, they've been fighting since the time of the Bible, that's also kind of lazy analysis. This conflict has been going on since the 1920s with breaks, lots of breaks, and things like that. So there's so much history to absorb, so much political narratives and political understandings to absorb, that I don't think that anybody can get away with doing something too short. So just keeping that in mind, that this conflict is always more complicated than what you'll see on a headline.
I love that. One of the sort of John Stuart Mill's on Liberty, he has this beautiful quote where he says, "He who knows only his own side of the case knows little of that." And it goes on, and it's this beautiful passage that everybody should read. And that's really like a reason why I wanted to do this podcast. Yesterday, I interviewed a brilliant Russian-American scholar and professor at University of Wisconsin at Madison, and his thoughts on like being an expert in Russian politics and walking through the similarities between this and the Russian conflict. I think I completely agree with you. I think that it's very nice. These things are way too complicated to try and summarize too deeply, and getting as many perspectives as you can. I love that you provided those two recommendations. Hopefully people can walk away with a higher resolution image of what's happening.
Yes, hopefully. And of course, the other thing, I guess the last thing to keep in mind is that we are emerging into this multipolar geopolitical environment. And I think it's important to remember that other things are still happening in the world. The Russians are launching a major offensive in eastern Ukraine to try to encircle a strategic city there. Syria, the Turks are carrying out an air campaign against the Kurds within Syria, which is getting very close to U.S. troops and may still also involve a ground invasion. Azerbaijan is pushing Armenians out of their own territory after having won a very brief war there last month. There are some, and Sudan is still fighting a civil war. Morocco is recovering from an earthquake. Yemen has a civil war. Syria's civil war isn't resolved. There are so many things happening right now where Israel and Palestine is going to take up the headlines until this war is de-escalated. And then in the aftermath is when people are going to kind of fall off the ball and this becomes page 6 news again. And when that happens, that's where it's going to be very easy to rely on stereotypes and shorthand to think about it. As the media invariably moves on. And just keep thinking about like your wider media habits. Everything that is at the top of the headlines doesn't mean that the other stuff has stopped.
And not just that it stopped, but I imagine you would recommend general audiences tune in a little more and just understand what's happening because it is important.
Yes, exactly. There are things that are of geopolitical impact that will directly hit their wallets, directly hit their lifestyles, could call some of their friends to mobilization in various countries that are all still unfolding. China, Taiwan, Russia, Ukraine, Iran, and the United States. Those are just some of the major geopolitical narratives that are going to define the next generation.
Thank you so much for your time. This was really amazing.
Yeah, thank you for having me.